Kang Tae-hyun had tended his quiet acreage in the valley for over a decade. To the urban thugs who arrived in flashy tracksuits and tinted SUVs, he was merely Old Man Kang, a dirt-stained relic of a forgotten era with no one to protect him. Harmless, invisible, an easy mark. They offered insults, then threats, then the heavy hand of terror. A greenhouse shattered, a grandson hospitalized, an ultimatum delivered in the mud. But what they failed to see was the ghost rising from the soil. Years as the Phantom Chairman, an empire built on silence, and a city that once trembled at his whisper. So when they returned to take the ground beneath his feet, they met a man they weren't meant to survive. Tae-hyun didn't just resist. He began a war they had already lost before the first shadow fell. The drilling men in tailored suits thought they were targeting an easy mark, a quiet, isolated farmer with no one to back him. They brought pressure, then violence, never realizing the man in the dusty work jacket was a nameless ghost who once ruled the neon streets of Seoul with a single word. But what happens when the target isn't just a farmer, but the retired head of an entire criminal empire? Before we dive into the Phantom Chairman's brutal reckoning, comment below where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because you won't want to miss the legendary stories we have coming up next. The dawn broke with a heavy, atmospheric stillness that only a life lived in atonement could command. As the first silver light caught the mist hanging over the rice paddies, Kang Tae-hyun stood at the edge of his field, his weathered, dirt-stained hands gently cradling a single sprout as if it were the most fragile secret in Seoul. His earth-toned work jacket and cracked rubber boots made him look like a part of the land itself, dusty, organic, and utterly insignificant. At 72 years old, his gaze remained unerringly steady, dark eyes watching the road not with the fear of a victim, but with the cold, calculating precision of a predator measuring his distance. He had spent 10 years training the world to forget his name, but his body still answered only to the iron discipline of the underworld. He was not waiting for mercy, he was waiting for the moment the soil would rise into shadow and that a phantom would step out of the dirt once more. The morning air tasted of damp earth and wood smoke as Kang Tae-hyun moved through his fields, his heavy black rubber boots sinking softly into the dark, fertile soil. At 72, his movements were deliberate and rhythmic, a slow dance of discipline that masked the lethality once coiled in his frame. Dressed in a faded olive work jacket and worn denim stained with the honest grime of the land, he appeared entirely organic, a dusty extension of the farm he had tended in quiet atonement for a decade. His silver-gray hair, unkempt but clean, caught the early light as he knelt to inspect a row of young sprouts, his dark eyes watchful and steady, far too steady for a simple farmer. To the passing world, he was merely Old Man Kang, a harmless, invisible relic of the valley whose life was measured by harvest cycles rather than blood deaths. This fragile peace was shattered by the discordant roar of an engine and the crunch of gravel as a sleek, midnight navy SUV tore up the dirt drive, trailing a plume of dust that coated the leaves of his pecan trees. For men spilled out, their presence a violent smudge against the earth tones of the farm. They wore flashy tracksuits and cheap cologne, their postures arrogant and unearned, the hallmarks of urban thugs who mistook silence for weakness. The leader, a man with a sneer that didn't reach his cold eyes, stepped forward and slapped a crisp white paper against Tae-hyun's chest. "Notice of eviction, old man," the thug barked, his voice grating against the quiet grace of the morning. He scanned the modest house and the heirloom greenhouse, with a look of pure disdain, seeing only an obstacle to a casino development and a poor man with no one to back him. Taehyun didn't flinch, he didn't even speak. He simply took the paper with a dirt-stained hand, his dark brown eyes remaining emotionless as they memorized the man's face. Mistaking this stoicism for terror, the thug reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of loose change. With a mocking laugh, he flung the coins at Taehyun's feet, watching them scatter into the mud and dust. "Consider that a down payment on your bus ticket out of here," he jeered, turning back to the SUV. As the vehicle sped away, kicking up more grit, Taehyun remained standing in the center of his perimeter. He didn't look at the coins. He looked at the horizon, the phantom within him stirring beneath the faded flannel as the soil began its slow, inevitable rise into shadow. The stillness of the rural night was not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, atmospheric blanket that Taehyun had spent years weaving for his family's protection. That silence was violently torn asunder by the screech of tires and the shattering of glass, a sharp, crystalline explosion that echoed like a gunshot across the valley. The Black Tiger gang had returned under the cover of ink-black shadows, their restraint gone, replaced by a reckless, urban malice. With heavy iron bars, they descended upon the heirloom greenhouse, the fragile structure his late wife had built with her own hands, systematically turning her legacy into a graveyard of jagged shards and crushed blossoms. The commotion drew Taehyun's young grandson from the house, his voice a thin, panicked cry in the dark. Before the old man could reach him, the boy was shoved roughly aside, his small frame striking the corner of a stone planter. He fell with a stifled gasp, a bloom of crimson appearing against his temple, as the thugs laughed and retreated into the night, their engines roaring in a triumphant, fading taunt. When the dust finally settled, Taehyun did not rush to the road in rage, nor did he cry out. He knelt first by his grandson, his touch surprisingly light and steady as he confirmed the boy's breath was rhythmic and his injury shallow. Only then did he stand in the center of the ruins, the moonlight catching the silver shine of his hair and the dark, nearly black intensity of his gaze. Surrounded by the organic debris of his former life, dusty browns, faded greens, and the smell of overturned soil, the farmer's warmth evaporated. His eyes, once calm and watchful, turned bone-chillingly cold and calculating, the kind of eyes that had watched empires rise and fall in the neon streets of Seoul. The phantom chairman was no longer merely stirring, he had arrived. As he looked at the shattered glass reflecting the midnight sky, the transformation was complete, the soil had risen into shadow, and the ghost had stepped out of the dirt. The Black Tigers had wanted a war with a poor, elderly farmer, but in the ruins of the greenhouse, they had finally awakened a dragon that had intended to stay asleep. The moon hung like a cold, silver blade over the north pasture as Taehyun carried a rusted spade to the base of the old pecan tree. The earth here was packed hard, a silent vault that had guarded his darkest secrets for a decade. With the same methodical discipline he used to till his crops, he began to dig, the rhythmic strike of metal against soil the only sound in the vast, watching night. 2 feet down, the spade hit a solid thud. He set the tool aside and reached into the dark pit, his fingers brushing against the rough grain of a cedar box, sealed with wax and wrapped in heavy, oil-stained canvas. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted from the warm, dusty scent of the farm to something sterile and sharp. Taehyun stood before the bathroom mirror, the dim yellow light casting deep shadows across his weathered features. With a straight razor that had remained untouched since his retirement, he began the ritual of transformation. The rugged, silver-gray beard, the mark of a humble man of the soil, was shorn away in precise, clinical strokes until only a sharply trimmed, charcoal-gray line remained. He worked in total silence, his dark eyes reflecting a terrifying, emotionless clarity. Next came the hair. He washed away the dust of the fields and used a heavy pomade to slick the thick, silver shine of his hair straight back. Every strand was brought under absolute control, a stark contrast to the unkempt farmer of the afternoon. As he worked, the earth-toned work jacket was discarded, replaced by a high-collar dark shirt and a tailored black suit made of matte fabric that seemed to swallow the light. Minimalist silver accents gleamed at his wrists, and he pulled on a pair of black leather gloves, the fit so perfect they looked like a second skin. He stood at the window, the phantom chairman, staring out at the ruined greenhouse. The dusty browns and faded greens of Old Man Kong had been buried in the pit beneath the pecan tree. In their place stood a ghost made of midnight navy and charcoal, a man who ruled empires with a single word. He checked the minimalist silver watch on his wrist, the time for atonement had passed. The Black Tigers believed they were terrorizing a poor man who had nowhere to go, but as Taehyun stepped into the shadows of his hallway, he knew they were merely the first casualties of a war he had already finished in his mind. The dragon was no longer sleeping, it was hunting. The farmhouse kitchen, once smelling of cedar and sun-warmed dust, now felt as sterile and cold as a mausoleum. Taehyun sat at the heavy oak table, his black leather gloves resting motionless on the wood, the polished silver of his watch catching the dim light. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath the table and retrieved a simple, encrypted burner phone, a dormant relic of a life he had tried to leave behind. With a steady hand, he dialed a number that had not been called in a decade. The line clicked open, but there was no greeting, only a sharp, indrawn breath on the other end. Taehyun did not speak right away, he let the silence stretch, a weight that commanded immediate, ancestral fear. "It is me," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the authority of a king long thought dead. "The soil is disturbed. I need the Black Tigers erased." On the other end, Director Park, once a loyal dog, who had risen from the chairman's shadows to the heights of Seoul's financial elite, felt his heart stutter. The debt he owed Taehyun was written in blood and gold, and in the world of the phantom, such debts never expired. "Chairman," Park whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of terror and reverence. "It will be done. By dawn, they will exist only in the past." Taehyun disconnected the call without another word, his expression remaining as emotionless as carved obsidian. He watched the clock, the seconds ticking away with clinical precision. In the glass and steel heart of Seoul, the machinery of the underworld began to turn at a touch from above. Within the hour, the Black Tiger Gang's offshore accounts, bloated with the spoils of extortion, were flagged and frozen by the very banks they thought protected them. Their digital wealth evaporated into a void of red tape and high-level blocks. Simultaneously, the gang's supply lines, the veins of illicit goods and clean construction contracts that kept them relevant, snapped. Trucks were diverted, warehouses were locked by administrative errors, and the urban thugs who had mocked a farmer's boots suddenly found themselves stranded in a desert of their own making. They were no longer a rising syndicate, they were a liability. Taehyun stood, his charcoal overcoat swirling around his ankles like a gathering storm. He did not need a gun to start a war, he only needed the silence of Seoul. As the first light of a new day touched the ruined greenhouse, the phantom chairman stepped out of the house, ready to let the gang realize that the man they had terrorized was the only one who could have saved them from what was coming next. The following night, the air over the farm grew heavy with the metallic scent of approaching rain. The Black Tiger Gang, reeling from the sudden collapse of their empire, sent a hit squad to the valley, 6 men armed with suppressed weapons and a desperate need to erase the witness of their failure. They moved with a reckless, amateurish urgency, their tactical boots trampling the very soil Taehyun had spent a decade nurturing. They expected to find an old man trembling in a darkened bedroom. They did not realize the farm had been transformed into a cold, structured grid of death. Taehyun moved through the towering stalks of the cornfield like a ghost, his long charcoal overcoat blending into the midnight navy of the sky. He did not carry a firearm. The phantom chairman had always viewed gunpowder as the language of the loud and the insecure. Instead, his power lay in restraint and the terrifying economy of his movement. He was a shadow stepping out of the dirt, appearing and vanishing before the hit squad's flashlights could even register a silhouette. The first attacker was taken near the irrigation ditch. Taehyun emerged from the darkness behind him, his black leather gloves muffling the man's gasp as he applied a precise, clinical pressure to the carotid artery. The man slumped into the soft earth without a sound. Taehyun didn't pause to watch him fall, he was already merging back into the rustling corn. One by one, the hunters became the hunted. A second man was neutralized behind the barn, his weapon stripped away and his consciousness extinguished by a single, sharp strike to the temple. The remaining 4, sensing the thinning of their ranks, fanned out in a panic, their breathing ragged and undisciplined. They began firing blindly into the stalks, the suppressed tips of their rounds swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the land. Taehyun watched them from the shadows of the old tractor, his dark eyes calculating and emotionless. He used their own fear against them, tossing a small stone to trigger a frantic pivot, then closing the distance in the moment of their distraction. He did not kill them, he simply erased their ability to fight, leaving a trail of unconscious bodies like discarded husks across his land. By the time the lead hitman reached the porch, he was alone, his hands shaking as he realized the poor farmer was nowhere to be found. Taehyun stepped into the pale light of the moon behind him, the silver shine of his slicked back hair the last thing the man saw before the world went black. The farm was quiet once more, protected by a man who had forgotten more about war than these thugs would ever learn. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy gray clouds lingering over Seoul, casting a dim, metallic light into the high-rise office of the Black Tiger Gang's leader. He sat behind a desk of polished mahogany, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts as he stared at the carnage of his empire. His bank accounts were empty voids, his men were disappearing into the silence of the countryside, and the very air in the city felt as though it were being sucked out by an invisible hand. The door chimed, a courier delivering a single, nondescript package wrapped in heavy charcoal paper. With trembling fingers, the leader tore away the wrapping to reveal a simple wooden box, its grain familiar and ancient. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was a minimalist silver watch. Its face was clean, devoid of branding, possessing only a sweep of silver hands that moved with a cold, mechanical precision. There was no note, no written threat, and no return address. He didn't need one. The sight of the timepiece turned his blood to ice. It was the signature of the phantom chairman, a relic of a legend that was supposed to be buried in the dirt. The watch was not a gift, it was an invitation to a funeral, his own. As the leader watched, the second hand ticked forward with a sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a predator closing in. It was a countdown, a clinical measurement of the time he had left before the soil fully reclaimed him. The elegance of the watch was a terrifying reminder of Taehyun's power, not the loud, frantic violence of a street gang, but the structured, inevitable ruin of a man who controlled time and shadow. The gang leader looked out his window at the sprawling city below, but all he could see were the dark, watchful eyes of an elderly farmer reflecting in the glass. The high-rise no longer felt like a fortress, it felt like a trap. Every tick of the silver hands was a footstep in the corn, a ghost stepping closer out of the dark. Taehyun had not just invited him to a meeting, he had invited him to witness the exact moment his world would end. The chairman was no longer just a memory of the past, he was the master of the leader's very last hours. The transition from the valley to the city was not merely a change of geography, it was a shift in the very laws of physics. As the charcoal overcoat swept through the glass doors of Seoul's elite district, the organic, dusty world of Old Man Kong vanished as if it had been a fever dream. In its place stood a figure of cold, geometric perfection. The silver shine of Taehyun's slick back hair caught the erratic pulse of the neon lights, reflecting a brilliance that felt more like industrial steel than aging bone. Every movement was structured and precise, his black leather gloves and polished shoes clicking against the marble with the rhythm of a closing trap. The Black Tiger nightclub was a cathedral of excess, a labyrinth of thumping bass and artificial fog designed to hide the smallness of men who played at being kings. But as Taehyun stepped into the inner sanctum, the atmosphere curdled. He did not shout, he did not reach for a weapon. He simply existed in the center of the room, a midnight navy shadow stepping out of a legend. The change was instantaneous. The heavy, rhythmic pulse of the music stuttered and died, replaced by a silence so sudden it felt physical. The young thugs, confused and defensive, reached for their waistbands, but they were frozen by the reactions of their superiors. The old guard, men with silver at their temples and scars hidden beneath expensive silk, felt the air leave their lungs. They recognized the matte fabric of the suit, the minimalist silver watch, and the dark, calculating eyes that had ruled the city before these children were born. "Chairman," one of the elders whispered, his voice cracking with a decade of suppressed terror. The name rippled through the room like a seismic wave, stripping the Black Tigers of their bravado. Taehyun did not acknowledge the bow that followed. He walked through the parting crowd with the terrifying economy of a man who owned the floor beneath their feet. The dusty farmer was a ghost buried in the fields. Here, in the heart of the neon, the phantom chairman had reclaimed his throne without firing a single shot. The reckoning had begun, and the city, like the land before it, knew better than to resist the rising shadow. The penthouse office of Minister Choi was a glass cage suspended over the glowing veins of Seoul, a monument to a power built on the ruins of better men. When the heavy doors swung open, Choi did not look up from his desk, his posture radiating the practiced arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable behind a shield of legislation and lies. But as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, he caught the reflection in the window, a sharp, structured silhouette in a charcoal overcoat that felt like a shadow stepping out of a grave. "Chairman," Choi said, his voice a polished mask of surprise that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his fingers. "I heard you were content playing in the dirt." Taehyun moved with a terrifying, silent grace, his polished black shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown. He did not sit. He stood before the minister, the matte fabric of his black suit absorbing the city's neon glare, leaving only the cold silver shine of his slick-back hair and the emotionless intensity of his dark eyes. "The dirt is where secrets are kept, Minister," Taehyun replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that commanded the air in the room. "But the soil eventually turns over." With a flick of his black leather glove, Taehyun slid a single, translucent file across the mahogany desk. It contained no threats, only the cold, geometric reality of bank records and decrypted transcripts from decades ago, the digital DNA of a betrayal. The evidence was absolute. It was Choi, then a mid-level strategist within the syndicate, who had funneled the names of the Phantom's inner circle to the authorities to pave his own path into politics. The Black Tiger Gang's casino land grab was merely the final piece of a cleanup operation Choi had started 30 years prior. Choi's face paled, the polished mask fracturing to reveal the coward beneath. "You think these ghosts matter now?" he hissed, though his eyes darted toward the paper. "I am the law. You are a tenant in a house I built," Taehyun said, leaning in until the minimalist silver watch on his wrist was the only thing Choi could see. "And your lease has expired." Taehyun didn't raise a hand, he simply presented the inevitability of Choi's ruin. The file didn't just contain syndicate secrets, it held the proof of Choi's current corruption, tied to the very development projects he had used to terrorize the valley. As Taehyun turned to leave, his long overcoat swirling like a gathering storm, he left Choi in the crushing silence of his own making. The Phantom had provided the truth, now, the city he had once ruled would do the rest. The descent back to the street felt like the shifting of tectonic plates, the cold, structured air of the penthouse giving way to the humid grit of the alleyway behind the Black Tiger headquarters. Taehyun stood in the shadows, his charcoal overcoat draped over his shoulders like a shroud, as the gang leader emerged from the rear exit, frantic and stumbling. The man was a ghost of his former arrogance, his flashy tracksuit stained with the sweat of a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the silver watch that still ticked with agonizing precision on his wrist. He didn't see Taehyun until he was 5 feet away. The leader froze, his hand trembling as he reached for a chrome-plated pistol tucked into his waistband, but the movement was sluggish, the desperate flailing of a man who had already lost. Taehyun didn't draw a weapon, he didn't even widen his stance. He simply stepped forward, his polished black shoes silent on the asphalt, and with a movement too fast for the eye to track, his black leather glove caught the leader's wrist. The power of restraint was a terrifying weight. Taehyun didn't break the bone, he simply applied a clinical, steady pressure that forced the leader to his knees, the pistol clattering uselessly into the gutter. There was no rage in Taehyun's dark eyes, only a calculating, bone-chilling indifference that was far more humiliating than a blow. He looked down at the man who had spat on his boots and realized the thug couldn't even meet his gaze. "You thought the soil was a place to hide a body," Taehyun said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the distant sound of sirens. "But the soil is where we bury the things that no longer serve a purpose." As if summoned by his words, the alley was suddenly flooded with the harsh, rhythmic pulse of red and blue lights. Black tactical vehicles swerved into position, sealing every exit. These were not the local patrols the gang had bought and paid for, these were the units controlled by the Bold Guard, and the allies Taehyun had awakened with a single phone call. The officers moved with a lethal, silent efficiency, their focus entirely on the kneeling gang members. The leader looked up at Tae-hyun, his face a mask of broken pride and dawning horror. He realized then that he wasn't being arrested by the law, he was being swept away by the chairman's cleanup crew. Tae-hyun released his grip and stepped back into the shadows, his long overcoat swirling around his ankles. He didn't look back as the handcuffs clicked shut. The struggle was over, not with a roar, but with a cold, structured finality. The phantom had finished his work in the city, it was time for the farmer to return to the land. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the city finally faded, replaced by the deep, atmospheric hush of the valley as the black sedan rolled to a stop at the edge of the north pasture. Kang Tae-hyun stepped out, his polished black dress shoes treading upon the gravel with a weight that was no longer hidden. He was still clad in the sharp, structured charcoal overcoat of the phantom chairman, a stark, midnight navy silhouette against the soft, honey-colored light of a dawn that felt earned. The city had been a place of clinical necessity, but the farm remained a place of atonement, and as he looked toward the horizon, the two worlds finally began to merge into a single, unified piece. He moved toward the center of the ruined greenhouse, his movements possessing the terrifying economy of a man who had reclaimed his throne, yet his hands remained the hands of a gardener. He knelt in the dirt, the matte fabric of his tailored black suit absorbing the morning mist, and with a gloved hand, he began to clear away the jagged shards of glass that had once signaled his defeat. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and retrieved a single, nondescript pouch of seeds, a variety his wife had loved, one that required patience, discipline, and the kind of watchfulness that only he could provide. As he pressed the first seed into the moist, dark earth, the visual contrast that had defined his life, the dusty farmer versus the cold chairman, seemed to dissolve. He was no longer poor, for the resources of an empire now stood behind his every boundary line. He was no longer harmless, for the entire valley now understood the cost of disturbing his soil. He was the silent chairman of the land, a guardian whose power was rooted as deeply as the pecan trees that watched over the graves of those he had loved. A soft bark echoed across the field as his grandson ran toward him, the boy's injury now a fading mark, his eyes bright with a future that had been secured by a man the world thought was invisible. Tae-hyun stood, his back straight, his gaze sweeping over the perimeter he had protected, inherited, and now reaffirmed. The phantom would not return to the dirt, nor would the farmer disappear into the shadow. Instead, they stood together in the early light, a sentinel of the valley, watching as the first sprouts of a new era began to break through the surface of a land that was, at last, truly and irrevocably his own. This story is central to the power of quiet strength and the dangers of underestimation. It explores the idea that true power does not always reside in flashy displays of wealth or loud threats, but in the iron discipline of a person who has mastered themselves. Tae-hyun's journey emphasizes that restraint is the ultimate weapon. By choosing when and how to reveal his true nature, he maintains total control over his environment. Additionally, the story also focuses on atonement, showing that while one can attempt to bury a violent past in the soil of a quiet life, true peace often requires one final, decisive stand to protect what is sacred. Kang Tae-hyun proved that the soil doesn't just grow crops, it buries those who mistake silence for weakness. If you enjoyed this journey from the dusty fields to the neon heights of Seoul, share this story with your friends. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a moment of justice. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you right here that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.